Tonight, though, we are of course here to celebrate the launch of Nancy Jooyoun Kim's debut novel, The Last Story of Mina Lee. The book came out just yesterday and has already been getting lots of love. Fortune calls it one of 9 books to read in September. The Los Angeles Times calls it joyous, painful, joyous, a story that cries out to be told. And it was just named a Reese's Book Club pick and a Book of the Month pick for September. Congratulations, Nancy.
Thank you so much.
So joining Nancy tonight is Ingrid Rojas Contreras. Ingrid is the author of Fruit of the Drunken Tree, a silver medal winner in first fiction from the California Book Awards and a New York Times Editor's Choice, which we also had the honor of launching here in this very room. Welcome, Ingrid. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Cut, The Believer, and elsewhere. A new work of nonfiction, a family memoir about her grandfather, a curandero from Colombia, who it was said had the power to move clouds, is coming from Doubleday in 2022. Born and raised in Los Angeles, Nancy Jooyoun Kim is a graduate of UCLA and the University of Washington, Seattle. Her essays and short fiction have appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Guernica, NPR, PRI's Selected Shorts, The Rumpus, Electric Literature, Asian American Writers Workshops, The Margins, The Offing, and elsewhere. The Last Story of Mina Lee is her first novel. So I think that's it for me. I'm very happy to turn it over now to Ingrid and Nancy. Hello, you guys. Thank you so much for joining us. And congratulations, Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting, Evan, and thank you to Booksmith. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for this. One of the great San Francisco bookstores.
We were talking in I guess the green room about it was just bringing so many good memories to see Evan with the background of the Booksmith, and it made me really happy. I'm so happy that we are finally here, and we've been waiting for this day. Nancy, I wondered like how you would describe this book to an audience who maybe hasn't heard of it yet, or maybe they've heard a few things, but how would you in your own words like describe it?
The Last Story of Mina Lee, it takes place in Los Angeles's Koreatown. It's about a complex mother-daughter relationship between a Korean immigrant single mother named Mina and her American-born daughter Margot. The book begins with a death. Margot discovers her mother's body in their apartment. And as she tries to figure out what happened to her mother on the night of her death, the plot unwinds in this dual narrative that alternates between Mina's point of view in the past and Margot's point of view in the present. And in this process, Margot's not only learning about her mother's life, but her own story and her own self as well. I sort of see these like dueling perspectives. I've always seen it as a kind of impossible conversation between two, because there are so many things that go unsaid between them. And part of that is a cultural, I think most of it has to do with language, the fact that because Mina lives in Koreatown and she works in a mostly Latinx area, she really only needs to know Korean and a little bit of Spanish to get by. While Margot's, she learns English, she grows up in the system here, and her Korean kind of stalls at a sort of elementary age. And so as she gets older and it becomes more and more important for her to sort of explain her feelings and her motivations and vice versa, they've actually grown apart in this, and it's created this rift between them. And so I see the alternating point of views as not only point of views, past versus present, mother versus daughter, but as a kind of conversation between all of those things that only could exist within the book, if that makes sense. Yeah,
I think that's such a beautiful description. One of the things that I really loved was how, the distance between like the first generation and like the second generation.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also a story about, what is passed down, but maybe like unsaid. Mm-hmm. Like those things that we receive from our parents that we can feel the contours of maybe like a story that is not being spoken, and the yearning for those stories. I was wondering if you would read a little bit to us.
Great, sure, no problem. So earlier today, I was on Instagram Live and I read a little bit from Mina's point of view in the past. And that was basically a sample of a phone conversation between the two of them, where you can kind of experience the many layers and the dynamics of the things that are said and kind of unsaid between them. And so I thought for tonight I would read something that takes place from Margot's point of view. And this is actually towards the beginning of the book. The book, as I said earlier, begins with a death. So, no spoilers there. It happens very early on. It's about page 20 in the book. It begins with a road trip. Margot's friend Miguel is moving down to LA, and sort of Margot uses this as an opportunity to go down to LA and maybe visit her mother at the same time. But then when she calls her mother a few days before they leave, her mother doesn't pick up the phone. And so she spends the entire time worrying about her mother, which is, this sort of nightmare of like, maybe I'm overreacting. Like, it's just been a couple days. Maybe it's not that big of a deal. So we just kind of are going to see what ends up happening when she arrives at her apartment. And I chose this passage because I think it shows the sort of beginnings of Margot, where her mental state is at and her relationship with her mother before she actually finds her mother's body. And we'll sort of spend our time in this story as you read the book, seeing how she evolves to know her mother and to know herself. They pulled up to the front of the building that she and her mother had lived in for as long as she could remember, a nondescript gray stucco 3-story complex. The windows on the bottom floor had security bars over them. The large agaves planted out front resembled tired sentinels that badly needed a day off. Margot and her mother lived on the middle floor in a 2-bedroom unit with a small north-facing balcony that looked partially out onto another almost identical building and back alley. "Let's sit here for a bit," she asked. The old embarrassment rose from the pit of her stomach, the shame she felt when she brought classmates home from school to work on group projects. Margot and her mother never entertained or invited anyone inside for fun. No matter how clean her mother tried to keep things, the space always seemed shabby and disorganized, a closet for storage and sleeping and fighting rather than a home. But what else could her mother afford? Miguel touched her arm. "Do you want to call your mom again? Does she have a cell phone?" Margot took a deep breath and unbuckled her seatbelt. "She has one that she uses for emergencies, but it's never on. It's a flip phone, and she doesn't know how to check voicemail." "Sacrilege," she said in a bad French accent. "She's technologically in the Stone Age," Margot went on. "She can't really read English either, and her eyes are kind of bad. My Korean isn't good enough to help her. It always ends in a fight." How many hours had she spent, words stumbling like stones out of her mouth, trying to explain something in Korean to her mother? A utilities bill, how to work the remote control, a car insurance policy. And in those hours, Margot would always slip, somehow yelling at her mother, as her mother had often done to her as a child when she had misbehaved by oversleeping, by missing church, even by falling ill and needing to go to the hospital. Her mother had once screamed, "How am I going to pay for this? Why don't you take better care of yourself?" Her mother didn't have time for empathy. She always had to keep moving. If she stopped, she might drown. "Would you mind waiting in the car?" Margot asked. The broken security gate shrieked, then slammed behind her. Holding her breath, she climbed the dark, dank staircase, which smelled of wet socks and old paint fumes, to the second floor, where she knocked on the apartment door. The fisheye was empty and dark. This was no longer her home, yet with a memory that lived not in her head but in her hands, she turned the key for the deadbolt, which was already unlocked, and then the doorknob. She had spent most of her life, her childhood, dreading the inside of that apartment, not out of fear, but out of hatred and spite. Hatred for her mother, hatred for the money they didn't have, hatred for her father, missing, gone, a coward, hatred for her mother's accent, hatred for the furniture stained, falling apart, hatred for herself, her life. She hated it all. She wanted this world to disappear, to burn it all down. As she opened the door, a dark odor of decayed fruit, putrid and sharp, swelled around her head like a tidal wave. Acid erupted from her mouth onto the arm that shielded her face. She flipped on the light. There was a broken ceramic sculpture of the Virgin Mary on the floor, tour brochures on the coffee table, and in this intimate chaos, her mother face down on the carpet with her right arm extended, the left one by her side, her feet in sheer nude socks. Later, Margot would remember the screams and would realize that they were coming from her. She fell to her knees. The hallway's amber glow was soft like feathers. Face tingling, she lay her forehead on the carpet where the head of a tiny nail pressed against her skin. Miguel's hands abruptly gripped her shoulder from behind, easing her to her feet. They wobbled weak down the stairs into the open air, the street. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, the sky became the longest bruise, purple and blue. The cruel light left its mark. She rested on the uneven curb, head in her arms, folded on her knees, Miguel next to her, hiccuping through tears. She struggled to breathe. Maybe she should have checked her mother's pulse. Maybe she shouldn't have called the police. What if her mother was only hurt badly or drunk? No, she never drank, and a person that was hurt would never lie on the floor face down like that. And she couldn't bear the thought of being near that smell, that body, that first time she had seen her mother in almost a year. That was her Oma. That was her head. Those were her feet. Sirens blared from a distance, getting louder as they arrived. She directed 2 police officers and an EMT to her mother's apartment. Another 2 officers asked her questions. She was appalled at how little she could answer, but she did tell them miscellaneous things about her mother, that she worked all day at the store and that she went to church. A wiry Korean man in his 60s, perhaps the landlord or even a janitor, spoke to the officers for about 10 minutes. Afterward, he stood on the sidewalk smoking with a few casual observers who had emerged out of the surrounding buildings, curious about the lights and the noise. They took her body away in a black bag on a stretcher. Her name was Mina, Mina Lee. Yes, that was her mother.
Thank you. That is such a stunning beginning. Even I think those details, I think the word intimate, when we get to the word intimate in that moment, when she's walking into the intimate chaos, that line is just so amazingly placed. And all the details of what she's seeing when she comes in. Yeah, it's very striking. Even the emotional kind of like weight, the emotional weight of the history of them, and yeah, you just kind of like alluded to it in the reading that you just had with hatred for her accent and hatred for like the way that they lived and all of that. And it strikes me, after reading the whole book, how you kind of handled what is, I think for young people that are maybe like born here or like second generation immigrants, where you feel like the vulnerability of what being an immigrant is. And it's almost like something that you want to not be there, because you don't want to have that, to be so vulnerable, like so openly. And I really love the way that you folded it into the book. I was wondering what I think you're kind of like writing into like the demands of the country for that, the pressure to like be the same is maybe like what is the other side of that shame. Pressure to kind of become American, which is kind of a pressure of erasure, like the pressure to just erase where you came from and like erase what happened before. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about what you were trying to give life to, or what you were trying to give voice to through this book.
The word erasure is really important. I think that that's a great way to describe it. I think both Margot and Mina are attempting to, as we see their two storylines, they're attempting to resist erasure in so many ways. They're attempting to kind of create their own storylines. And I think that Margot is only able to do so, though, after her mother dies. I think this gives Margot this quality of, we learn early on in the first page, she asks things of her mother like, why don't you learn to speak English? So as the world kind of erases her mom, she is actually actively also chipping away at her as well. And I think in the process of this book, she realized that she's erased herself in so many ways because she has been erasing her mother. But I think it's because she has internalized and kind of absorbed the narrative where there isn't really a space for her mother to exist, because there are no real stories about women in her mind, at least with her like limited knowledge. And she often uses, there's references to television, there's references to movies, and kind of a lack of representation of women and these sort of marginalized women, in particular, immigrant women, women of color, in these sorts of, either stereotype roles or sidekick figures, but to actually show all of the nuances, the sort of, even the ugly parts of their emotional lives, the parts where she's hateful towards her mother, and that makes her seem like an awful person, you know what I mean? But that's actually a very real feeling for her. And so I feel like this story, in the way it's constructed, is really showing how these women, they not only sort of endure. I think that's a very common narrative for immigrants. Like, it's like this, like, well, look at how hard they work, look at how they endure. They not only endure, but they actually create change and rewrite things in surprising ways. And so the creativity of these women, I think, is on display here. And that's kind of what's resisting erasure. Margot is in a way creating a counter narrative, because, the narrative is that this woman, she is working class, she just died in her apartment, she's older, she just had an accident, and she lives alone, and this happens, And so in the process of her figuring out what happened to her mother on the night of her death, she's writing an alternative story for her mother, right? She never gets the full story the way Mina, the way the reader gets to the full story. She never knows Mina I think that we all sort of fall in love with Mina to a certain extent. And she never gets that full story, but I feel like she is just at the beginning of constructing that. And so, yeah.
And it's also written like a mystery. And it's very much a page turner. And the things that Margot starts to uncover, I think, are just surprising. Things that she kind of realizes that she didn't know her mother at all, or didn't know her life, or just kind of like some of the adventures or other scary moments that she was having in her own time. I did want to ask you about inspiration. I don't know if there was a particular moment that inspired this book, or if you, however you found your way to this story. What was that like?
I was primarily inspired by two things. The first was, and I wrote about this for Reese's Book Club blog, and I also wrote about it in a Salon piece that came out today, but it was, I think, the idea for this book probably happened in 2008, but I think it goes back a little bit further than that, which is in 2004. My father died in a car accident, and it was at the same time that I was moving away to Seattle to go to grad school. And so my parents are divorced. My father is estranged from me, and I suddenly became overwhelmed with this feeling that my mother, who's like now my one remaining parent, could die while I was gone. And I felt very responsible for her all of a sudden. And so in a lot of ways, I was projecting this anxiety that I achieved through my father dying onto my mother. And I sort of started seeing her as this like frail person, and having these like ideas of like, what would happen if my mother one day just didn't pick up the phone, and I was like in Seattle and I couldn't reach her in time. And I had internalized this idea that I'm supposed to save her, as some children do. And so that kind of imagery and that sort of, I think, trauma mixed with, what I was trying to deal with at that point in my life, I think created the sort of nightmare that started this book. Was that nightmare was the inspiration. And it wasn't until 2011 that I started writing it as a novel, and I saw it as this sort of thing that was like worth pursuing as deeply uncomfortable as it is, right? So it's like a pursuit of the nightmare. It's a pursuit of my fears in some interesting way. And the novel is not autobiographical, but I feel like it began with that sort of emotional and like psychological state. And the second thing that inspired this book very heavily is just the communities that I grew up in. I think the Asian American, Latinx communities I grew up in, I think that, that's kind of obvious in the book by the atmosphere and the places and the settings and stuff. Just having grown up being an avid reader, relatively quiet person, classic introvert, I feel like I was just this, and also the youngest child, I was in some ways this very sponge-like person. And so there were so many stories that were always being told around me and that I was listening to. And I feel like I always wanted to like know more. So in some ways, this book is like me attempting to sort of fill these like curiosities, these silences that I think, like these stories are almost always like half told, you know what I mean? So you always wonder what's that second half. And so, yeah.
I mean, that's my favorite thing. It's just half over here story, because then I can imagine that.
Yeah, exactly. Like it just gives you just enough, and then you end up just being able to run with it. And I've gotten so many ideas that way. I've also gotten so many ideas from things that I fear and from nightmares.
I know. I don't know if other people know, but if you're in a public space, I mean, not anymore, but when you were in a public space, like all the years that you've been in a public space, if there was probably like a writer around you, like overhearing everything.
Yes. Yeah. And that's kind of
being like, that's kind of a good line.
I know. And I realized during this pandemic, that's like literally what I miss the most. It's people watching. And not like in any, it's literally just people who like walk by a window, you know what I mean? Like it's that casual, it's just like these glimpses of lives, and just the amount the amount of sort of like inspiration that can give you, I really miss that. So.
One of the things that really took my attention in this book was how much food there was. There was just so much food, in a way that I felt like I was maybe constantly hungry, or just constantly kind of being assaulted with like the all the sensory details of what delicious food looks like and smells like. I really loved this one moment in the novel where you called let's see if I can, in my very messy notes, American food barbaric, and I think you're describing it, I think it's Mina,
right? Like the burger and the head, like
and then Korean food as a it's so much about patience, you wrote, and you described like a soup as like volcanic, which is, I mean, just that all the descriptions of food. I know that for me, having the food from my land, it's kind of is the only way that you can return, in a way, like have a very quick like return to what it was. What were you thinking consciously of food when you were drafting the book?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think for many years I resisted food, especially for many years I resisted food. I resisted writing about food, especially.
You just denied it for you.
I was just denied myself entirely. Yes, no, for many years. I've been writing on some level, I've been writing for most of my life, but I've been working on a novel on some levels for about like 15 years or something like that. And this is my first book, obviously. But for many years, I kind of denied writing about food because I thought that and I had taken so many Asian American studies classes and books on Asian, read so many books about Asian American literature and like criticism and things. And there was always this like criticism that there was always this emphasis on food, you know what I mean, to make it accessible to different audiences. And so I kind of, for at least a few years of my like kind of writing life after grad school, I didn't really write about food at all. But then I realized that so much of, and this is just a reality of our life, so much of how we communicate with each other is during those moments over meals. Especially for me, like I had grown up in a very working class family. I only saw my mother sometimes my mother worked graveyard shifts. So sometimes I only saw my mother for a window of time that was like 1 hour long. And that was when we were going to eat and and do the dishes, and then she was going to go to work, or, you know, something like that, right? So in so many of our lives, and this is, I think, you know, a lot of people's lives, the only real opportunity to sit down with people is over food, right? Like, even when you get together with your friends, you usually are having a meal together, or you're going out for a drink. There's some kind of level of consumption that's happening. And so the reality of this story is that, you know, food, because they don't have language, food is not only provides this, is the sort of language for her mother to not only, you know, I think food is love is kind of obvious, but I think food is also like a form of teaching self-care, you know what I mean? Like, I think that she is teaching Margot, Mina the mother is teaching Margot how to nourish herself in a world that is often very harsh and cruel. And sometimes all you have is a meal that you can share. You don't even have any language to describe what you've been through. You don't even have any language to describe your feelings for each other, but you share something, and it's in the sort of simplicity of the gestures. And one of my favorite food scenes is between Mrs. Beck, who's the friend of Mina, and Mina and Mrs. Beck are in a restaurant, and they're having a dinner after like many years of not seeing each other. And there's so much communicated in just how the food is on the table and the way they're kind of sharing food and like serving each other. And I think that sort of subtlety it's just so rich with what is lacking in the actual conversations between the two. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also, now that you're talking about language and food, there's also this moment where Margot is I think remembering like the way that her mother peels the skin from an apple, and how that this kind of makes her realize that if she kind of nurtured it, that maybe she would be good at some kind of like either drawing or like 3D art. And that there's this heartbreaking line in there about she thinks something like, but this is not something that like a girl like me is supposed to be wanting, or it feels like it's you know, out of my reach.
Too ambitious. Yeah.
Ambitious for someone who like grew up in poverty. Is that something like that was the line?
Yeah, there's this line where she sort of relates. So the mother, that's one of the strong images in the book. She's peeling an apple in the way that, you know, some of our mothers can do and I can't, which is that continuous ribbon of skin, you know what I mean? That peel, and it's kind of this magical thing once it's off, because it's like holding its shape, you know? So so there's this really great three-dimensionality to it.
Can your mom do that?
I'm sure. Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, my mom is like, no way. No way. I mean, and I just think that just goes to show, like, I don't know, just how much more patient and like how much care she puts into like presenting things too, you know what I mean? And I think once again, that's that communicating, like, this is an act of love for you. You know, it's like the simple gesture, but it's like, I want it to be pretty for you.
Yeah.
Like, I want, you know, it's just gorgeous. Yeah. And so and that's actually a great point, relating that to sort of Margot's own artistic ambitions, is that she just sees, she cannot get past the limits of like her current life, and she cannot see how she can live in a world where her ideas are sort of like manifested in any way. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense to me, because I think that, you know, at this point in her life, she's paying off college loans, she's in her mid-20s. I think she's, you know, kind of just interested in finally achieving the sort of middle-class life she's always dreamed of, but at the same time, she's denying herself this desire to like make new things. Mm-hmm. She doesn't even know what that looks like, you know, because it's so repressed, and it has to be. She knows she has to take care of her mother one day. I mean,
and this novel is breathing space into this. Many people's experiences, if you have a parent who has PTSD, they've gone through something, that you in some ways inherit what it is without you knowing exactly what it is. So it's like you inherit a lot of the, you know, some of the limitations in thinking, or the limitations in ambition, or what you think you can do, what you're allowed to do, like those kinds of things. And we see them very clearly in this novel, about the way that that yeah, Mina is kind of like wanting to dream and then careful to not dream too much. And then in that moment, Margot is kind of has this kind of artistic ambition that she doesn't feel like she can chase.
Mm-hmm.
Was can you tell me about like what were your drafts like as you were working on the novel? Yeah, I'm just curious about like the process of the making of the book.
Yeah, I mean, early on, so I probably started writing this novel in 2011, but I didn't really have a chance to sit down with it and treat it as like a project, you know. When in 2011, I was probably just working on it on the weekends for a couple hours, you know, sort of dabbling in it, trying my best to get to it. But I was also working like a full-time job that just took all my energy from me. So, and then in 2014, I really started to, I very much work, I'm not an outliner. I mean, that's evolving for me right now, but I would say in general, I love sort of spending time as much as possible just in characters, in scenes, and like finding unexpected moments, and then from there getting ideas for stories and things like that. So for me, I mean, I would say this novel probably had about somewhere between 10 to 15 drafts. I lost track of it. And it wasn't until, you know, the last, you know, 10 to 13 or something that I had a super strong sense of like the plot and the shape. It took that long. Like it took so many drafts to just, and I actually enjoy working that way. Like that sounds like hell for like a lot of people, but I love it. It just allows me to have this sort of level of intimacy that I really enjoy. And I feel like it produces stories in a way that's so organic to the sort of psychological and sort of emotional landscape of the characters, as opposed to just like putting together a plot and then figuring out how this character is going to fit in it, you know? So yeah, that was my process. It's grueling. I mean, it's like, if you could imagine if that many drafts, I mean, you know, that means that I probably have read this book, you know, like 100 times or something like that, you know, at least, right? So it's intense. Yeah. And it's great. I mean, it's, you know, amazing. It's an amazing experience. It's hard work, but it's amazing.
And I want to remind the audience, if you have questions, if you could type them in for us. We're going to move to Q&A in a few minutes. So you mentioned that you're not an outliner, but you're kind of changing your mind now. Does that mean that you're working on something?
Yes, I am. And the reason why I'm outlining now is because this is a novel that also takes place outside of outside of Los Angeles's Koreatown. It is about a family that is still grieving the death of a mother 5 years after. And it deals with issues of homelessness and sort of all of these sort of unspoken things between them, and, you know, sort of the dreams and the things that they've sacrificed in order to sort of achieve some form of success in this country. And I'm outlining only because these are characters that I have thought of from many years ago. So I actually know a lot about them already. Like I wrote a novel, I guess, like I finished another novel back in 2010. And so these are characters from like practically another novel. Mm. So because I've already like done all of the hard work in terms of like, I've written a lot of scenes with them already. I figured out like most of their dynamics and all of that. Outlining at this point makes sense. So it just didn't make sense for a newer novel, the way The Last Story of Mina Lee.
I'm so interested in this. So the plot is always comes last for you.
I mean, yeah, I guess I would say so. Yeah, I would say so. I have an idea of like an arc, but I never really quite know. I like love that feeling. Like I, you know, intentionally write that way. I
love the sense of discovery. I think that's
I love like working in the dark almost. You know what I mean? And like I think, you know, I think that it kind of allows you to discover things in a really fresh way. And yeah, so I always begin with scenes and characters and imagery, things like that. And I start to sort of think about what the images mean, and like the fruit is one image in this novel, the Ferris wheel is another. You know, there's a couple scenes that take place on the Santa Monica Pier on the Ferris wheel. So I kind of sort of pieced together stories based upon what I know of the characters, what imagery really strikes me, why I'm like, for whatever reason, keep returning to certain images. And I know it's because there's some kind of meaning there. So I'm kind of excavating meaning along the way. And then I'm like, so that means, in the next chapter.
I know.
Yeah.
I have the same process where it's just kind of like, it feels like hieroglyphics. And then it's like I go back and figure out
with like your magnifying glass.
Yeah, I'm like, what was that? I haven't spent that much time in LA, but I loved the way that you depicted the place in this novel. It seems to be where everything seems to be unkind to this community of immigrants. The space, like the setting of LA, is something that seems to like really hold them. And that Ferris wheel, which comes back a few times in the book, is just kind of, every time that it came up, it just had this kind of very hopeful, I don't know, it was just this very nice, like holding the characters, like something to bring them up, where so many characters being immigrants and feeling unmoored kind of felt kind of like all over the place. Was setting like very present as you were writing it? It certainly felt that way as I was reading it.
Yeah, I definitely wrote this as a kind of love letter to the Los Angeles that I know and, love. I think that, and I'm very intimately familiar with, and that I have a kind of romance with, I guess I would say. And I'm very aware that the Los Angeles that I know is sort of the opposite of the Los Angeles that a lot of people know. And so I feel a kind of indebtedness to this place. Like, I think that for myself, I feel like, I myself had a single mother. And so I spent a lot of time alone. I spent a lot of time just walking around the streets. And I feel like, the city itself in some ways raised me and like took care of me in a really interesting way. And so, I definitely think that for me, the city in this is in setting and place. They're all kind of characters that we are kind of getting to know. And this is a slightly rougher side of their character, but I also think it's extraordinarily genuine. And there's so many moments of beauty, right? I mean, so many moments of like intimacy between the unexpected characters put together. So many moments of beauty, even when like looking at the sunsets and the sort of outline of like the palm trees up against the like pollution, and what a beautiful sunset that produces, the sort of ironies of the city itself. And so, this was definitely kind of city as character for me in a lot of ways.
And in some ways, once you move away, you're able to kind of very clearly see the place, I think, or it's kind of like a different looking back at it.
Definitely.
I haven't seen you since the Reese Witherspoon book club was announced. That was very exciting to see. What was receiving that news like?
It was, it just, my editor FaceTimed me out of nowhere and one morning, and she never.
That seems so stressful.
She never FaceTimes me, and so it was like particularly frightening, because it's either like really good or really bad, right? But it's probably really good, to be honest, because usually you don't do FaceTime for like something really bad. And so I knew something extraordinary had happened, and it was, I don't even know. I mean, it's surreal. I'm so grateful for it. I mean, it's just like this, I could have never imagined. I mean, this book to me is such an intimate story. It's so, I worked on this so privately for so many years. It was just like, we all know this as writers. It's like that thing you're working on, but you can't explain to anyone. Like, it doesn't really make sense.
I'm so tired of hearing you talk about the book that you're working on.
Yeah, that too. So it's kind of like this thing that was so private for me, and I was so just blown away that she had connected so much with the story. And it's just been like tears. It's been like sweating. It's been like so many. It's just been such a ride, because I don't feel like anything quite prepared me for this type of news, you know what I mean? Especially when you're working on a book like this. It feels like forever when you're working on a book like this, because it's like so many years, right? And you just never know. And you hold on to the story because you know that there's something there, you're obsessed with it, you can't let go of it, it won't let go of you, you know, even if it makes no sense to anyone else why you're doing this to yourself, because it's hard work. So it's been, I'm just so grateful. It's such an honor. It's extraordinary. It's also like a lot of fun. I mean, it's great. Yeah.
She seems like a really fun book club leader.
She's amazing. She is brilliant. Yeah, it's been, I
just watched, I mean, I'll go to questions in a minute, but I just want to say that I just watched Election Day. Did you ever watch that with Reese Witherspoon?
Yes, Election. Yeah, so smart.
Election,
yeah, that was like that Alexander Payne movie, I think. Yeah, like so great.
Okay, so let's see here. So Yalitza wants to know what was it about the last draft that made you feel like it was done? So how do you know that when something's done?
A great question. I mean, how did I know it was done? I mean, I think you never really feel like it's done. So I think there's a point where you just like hit a deadline, but I felt like when I had finished my book, I felt like I completely understood my book on like a level where like nothing was mysterious to me any longer. And that I feel like I had accomplished what I wanted to say and what I needed to say. I guess that's when I knew I was done. So it's really interesting because I think in the early drafts of a book, you don't even quite kind of know what you're saying. Or like you think you know what the book's about and it sounds good on paper because there's like a bunch of words that you're stringing together and it sounds fancy or something. But then when you get into it,
that feels good.
Yes, exactly. But then you get into it and you realize there's so much in here that isn't really serving the purpose of like what you want to say. And so for me, I felt like I was finished. And I know that, you know, when I was finished, I know that there was other work that needed to be done, like editing and things like that. But I felt like I was finished when I felt like I really understood this book on like on a different level. I understood what it was about. I understood what all the scenes were doing. And the ending made total sense to me. Like, so all of these things just kind of like lock in, but it took so many drafts to get there. I mean, you know, it's not like something that, you know, we're talking about, you know, at least 5 years, right? So
yeah. I think this is why, you know, I was so impressed with how the plot in the book works. It just works like clockwork. So just kind of knowing that it's one of the last things that you got to or that you uncovered in your process is so surprising because it, you know, when I just reading the finished version, it just feels like it's so inevitable that it almost feels like it must have been there from the beginning.
And it wasn't. Yeah, no, it wasn't. Yeah, so it was actually, I mean, thanks for saying that. That's really, it was actually I felt like it was one of the last things that I had probably, I mean, obviously, and what I mean by last thing, I mean, like, that was like a year before my final draft was, you know, like, it wasn't like literally last minute. I didn't like in one night.
Yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't like, you know, I just like, I didn't just figure out the plot one night. And then like, I worked on it probably over a year, but it took me really just the time. So for me, plot wasn't actually that hard. For me, I think meaning was harder for me. So once I figured out the meaning, then I was able to find the plot that I felt like said what I really wanted to say.
Oh, I love that process. Yeah. Someone wants to know, Karen Clark wants to know, what motivates you to stick with the process?
That's such a good question. I mean, motivation is the hardest thing, right? I mean, I think especially right now, and like for anyone trying, I mean, we're all trying and to do so many things and stay motivated. For me, the only thing that gave me, and I'm not a super disciplined person. I'm not like, I have no exercise regimens, foods, like I eat whatever, you know, like I'm just not a particularly disciplined person. But for me, the only thing that allowed me to stick to this, stay motivated, stay on task was, I feel like I found the story that literally only I could write. And so in some ways, this story, I belong to the story. Mm-hmm. And every day when I return to it, it's like I am indebted to finishing it in an interesting way. And so I feel like once you find the project, whether it's a novel or if it's some chair that you're building or whatever, some interesting thing that you're doing with your life, once you find that thing that like you literally feel like only you can complete in the way that you would like to see done, which for me was this novel, and a novel that I desperately wanted to read and only I could really make it. Yeah, I felt beholden to it. I felt indebted to this project. I couldn't say no to it. It wouldn't say no to me, you know?
That's such a beautiful way to put it. I love the idea of just finding something that you belong to and it belongs to you at the same time.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I think, and I think, and everybody kind of asks like, well, how do I find that thing? Like, that's like, what are you talking about? Like, why do you make it sound so easy? It's not easy. It actually took me like, this is the second book, or, you know what I mean? There was like another book before this. And so it's actually not easy to find that story. Yeah. It just takes time, and it takes like honesty, I think. Mm-hmm. Like to find to find and admit the thing that you're, you know, and for me, you know, to say that a story begins with a phone call and a mother not picking up a phone sounds so tiny and like random, you know, but I think everybody has something that, you know, kind of haunts them or kind of bothers them or kind of gets to them. And it's about pursuing that thing that for whatever reason bothers you, and you're kind of in the process tapping into all of these things that make you who you are, right? So
what has it been like? Have you been trying to write during this time? And what has that been like if you've been successful? I know that many have, you know, many of us have not.
Yeah, a lot of people are struggling right now, and it makes total sense. I mean, you know, putting on shoes in the morning. Like, I think I was on a text chain about buying shoes. I don't, but I was on a text chain where somebody was talking about like Rothy's or something. And I was like, who is talking about shoes these days? Like,
yeah.
Yeah. Like, why are we talking about shoes? Like, that's not even in my, yeah. So, you know, but people are struggling with very basic things. And so for me, writing has been, yeah, I've been, pretty productive just because I've had to be, like, I've had a lot of deadlines, and so that helps. I have deadlines, so I think that has been
very good.
Yeah, like, I don't know how, I think I still find a lot of, you know, especially, you know, they say that when you're, you know, coming out with a book that you should keep yourself busy and like be working on another book and all of that. So I have been working on my second book and I love it, you know, so as long as I'm able to find quiet time. In the beginning, it was really hard with the pandemic because we were all adjusting to like the new work situation and all of that. As long as I can find about like maybe 2 to 3 hours of time to work on it, I will work on it, and I enjoy it. Yeah. So I've been pretty productive, actually. Yeah.
That's great. There's a question related to your second novel that you're working on. This is from Angie. What is the driving force that makes this new novel different from the current novel that just came out? Or because the characters are not the same as the characters are the same to the previous novel that you wrote before.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess the question is how are they?
I guess from the appearance of like these characters that you are now working with, what is the difference between like the first iteration of the book versus the one that you're currently writing?
I mean, I guess I would say that I figured out a plot. I finally figured out.
Because you figured out the meaning?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, you got that right. Yeah,
How many novels have you written?
So this is my first. So The Last Story of Mina Lee is my first. It's my first completed novel. And my the novel that I wrote before this, you know, I thought it was completed, but you know, it went out and it, you know, I was not able to get it published. And so, but those characters have stuck with me all these years. And so then I've just been thinking about it, you know, within the past year, and I've been thinking about, you know, just different things that were kind of, you know, haunting me at this point, I guess. And I sort of, sort of started to put together meaning. And then from there, I've started to put together plot. And so now things are sort of clicking into place in a really nice way.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from Amy Elizabeth. What has been the most surprising part of this process for you?
It's the process of publishing a novel, or?
I think so.
The most surprising part has been the collaboration that goes into every book, the incredible people. I mean, I worked in such obscurity for so many years. Like, and what I mean by obscurity is, like, let's just say I don't even know how long this was. I feel like I had maybe like a 6 or 8 year streak of like 100% rejection rates or something like that. I mean, it was dark. Like, it was like evil. Like, it was like, I mean, you know, a lot of people, they say like, oh, my 99% rejection. And, you know, I mean, I was literally like facing 100% rejection rate at a certain point in my life. And this was everything. I'm talking about literary journals. I'm talking about residencies, all kinds of residencies. And so what is so surprising to me is how, once you find an incredible team, like my agent and editor and this sort of great house, suddenly it becomes this really collaborative process where you have like a team and like people that you can like ask for like help, and you don't feel bad. Like, you're not just asking favors, but they're like just so eager and like happy to help you. And so the collaboration aspect of it has been the most surprising thing to me. I never realized, I always thought, you know, when you publish the novel, you submit it in and it's just like this like perfect being or whatever. But there's been so much back and forth, so much, you know, it's just been great. It's wonderful. It's a lot fun. Like, that aspect is a lot funner than I had expected it to be necessarily.
And I love that your launch is during a full moon in Pisces.
Oh, I know. I know. I was looking at the moon last night and it was so beautiful, and I haven't looked at it yet tonight, but I was out letting my dogs use the bathroom and I noticed how gorgeous it was. And so, but I didn't realize until today that it was in Pisces, which is a water sign like myself. So I'm loving the Pisces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was going to say, because we're talking about patience a lot, and then it just reminded me of that line about the volcanic soup. You know, it's like the good things, like, you have to kind of like wait for and feel that the nourishment is there, and then just kind of like wait it out. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely my experience of writing too, that it just, patience is such a big part of it.
Yeah. And it's surprising how much you get from just, I think everybody thinks writing is, I've never been like a word counter or anything like that. I just don't like actually work that way. Like, the numbers just kind of just don't work for me. And like, so I've, you know, patience is surprisingly useful. Even just sometimes when I'm struggling to write something, it's just about like sitting in the room with your manuscript sometimes and like going through it enough and like being patient with it. And like, it's about timing and all of those things. And so, yeah, a lot of patience. And it's all worth it. It's all worth it.
It's all worth it. I know. I, you know, ask myself, you know, during the painful writing days, I ask myself, like, why do we do this? And then it just becomes so joyful. I think we have time for one more question, if anybody feels like giving us one more. Otherwise, maybe I'll give it like, we'll have like a little bit of suspense where I just wait for, if not, I'm wondering, like, what do you dream for this book? I know I was just wondering, like, what books, like, when you were writing this book, were you thought of this the last story of Mina to be in sisterhood with? So like, what kind of like book lineage do you hope your novel is joining?
There are so many, you know, everything from books about LA to books about family to books about mothers and daughters. I think that, you know, while I was writing this book, books that sort of were recurring, that sort of came up in my mind a lot were Another Country and Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. I love the Ferrante Neapolitan novels. I love Han Kang's work. And the reason why I love these books is because I feel like they have such an extraordinary amount of like almost brutal honesty to them and interiority while being sort of consistently aware of the world around them. And I guess that's the kind of work that I'm interested in. I'm interested in work that is, you know, very honest with itself, willing to admit it's, you know, with characters willing to sort of admit their own faults. And there's this kind of like intimacy and sort of delicacy and sort of rawness even to the way their emotional worlds and psychological worlds are explored without being sort of with a sense that the society at large or the culture at large is sort of in conversation with that constantly, you know, and the formation of, you know, individuals and stuff. So, yeah.
I can totally see that. So
I knew you could.
I want to thank Booksmith for hosting us. And if you're buying books tonight, please support Booksmith. They're such a wonderful bookstore. They're among my favorite bookstores in San Francisco. And it's so nice to see you, Evan.
You too, Ingrid.
Thank you, Evan.
Yeah, Nancy, congratulations. You guys both. This has been a really wonderful conversation. And it's been nice spending some time with you about The Last Story of Mina Lee. You guys should buy it if you haven't already. If you have, you should probably also buy it for like your friends. I just dropped that in the comments. So you have the link. Thank you all for joining us. Hope to see you all in person in the nearest future. But until then, please take care and stay well.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for spending time with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Nancy. Congratulations.
Thanks.
And best of luck with everything. Hope we can host you here in the store.
Yes, I would love that. Ingrid and I will return.
Please do. We'll have a fun, guys. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Good night. Thank you so much.
Good night.